When the German Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, they believed they were invading a nation stuck in the 19th century. German intelligence reports painted a picture of the Soviet Union as a colossus with feet of clay. They saw a massive army, yes. But they saw an army that moved at the speed of a walking man. The German General Staff was obsessed with logistics, but they viewed Soviet logistics with utter contempt. They noted that the Red Army relied almost exclusively on the railway system. Beyond the railheads, the Soviet transport network dissolved into chaos. The roads in Russia were not roads in the European sense. They were dirt tracks. In the summer, they were dust pits. In the autumn and spring, they were mud baths. The Germans observed that the Red Army used hundreds of thousands of horses to move its supplies. The few trucks the Soviets did have, the GAZA and the ZIS-5, were copies of old American designs from the 1920s. They were two-wheel drive. They were underpowered. They broke down constantly. To the highly mechanized German officers, who took pride in their Opel Blitz trucks and their half-tracks, the Soviet logistical tale looked pathetic. They laughed at the Panj wagons, the small, peasant carts pulled by shaggy ponies. They believed that once they smashed the Soviet rail lines and captured the depots, the Red Army would starve. A tank without fuel is just a bunker. A soldier without bullets is just a target. The Germans calculated that they could outmaneuver the Soviets simply because they could move faster. They planned to encircle the Soviet armies, cut their static supply lines, and watch them wither on the vine. And for the first 6 months of the war, they were right. The Soviet logistical system collapsed. As the Germans advanced, the Soviet rail network fell apart. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured not because they were cowards, but because they were encircled and had no way to get food or ammunition. The German officers wrote home, describing the primitive hordes and their chaotic rear areas. They saw the lack of motorization as proof of racial and cultural inferiority. They believed that a society that couldn't build a decent truck could never defeat the Third Reich. They were confident that the vast distances of Russia would work in their favor. They thought the Red Army would be unable to project power more than 50 miles from a train station. This arrogance blinded them. They didn't realize that their own logistical system, which also relied heavily on horses, was about to face the same mud. And they didn't realize that the primitive enemy was about to receive a technological transfusion that would turn them into the most mobile army on Earth. The Germans were laughing at a man walking, unaware that he was about to be given a racing car. The Soviet Union in 1941 was a railway empire. Stalin's industrialization drive had focused on heavy industry, steel, coal, and tanks. But he had neglected the road network. The logic was strategic. In a vast country, trains are the most efficient way to move raw materials. But in a dynamic war, trains are a trap. A train can only go where the tracks go. It is rigid. Predictable. The Luftwaffe knew this. German Stuka dive bombers didn't just hunt tanks, they hunted locomotives. They bombed the switching yards. They blew up the bridges. By destroying a few miles of track, the Germans could paralyze an entire Soviet army group. The last-mile problem became the Soviet nightmare. Supplies would arrive at a railhead 50 miles behind the front. But between the railhead and the soldiers fighting for their lives, there was nothing but mud. Without reliable trucks, the supplies sat in the rain. Soldiers at the front were rationing bullets while millions of rounds sat uselessly at a depot a day's march away. Wounded men died at the front because they couldn't be evacuated to the field hospitals near the stations. The Soviet counterattacks in 1941 failed largely because they couldn't sustain momentum. A Soviet tank division might break through the German line, but its fuel trucks couldn't keep up. The tanks would run dry and be destroyed by German infantry. It was a logistical thrombosis. The heart was beating, but the blood wasn't reaching the limbs. The Germans exploited this ruthlessly. They would bypass the Soviet strongpoints and strike deep at the rail lines. Once the connection was severed, the Soviet army was effectively decapitated. Stalin and his generals realized that their reliance on rail was a fatal weakness. They needed flexibility. They needed off-road capability. They needed to decouple their armies from the iron tracks. But Soviet industry was in chaos. The factories that built trucks were either captured or were being frantically moved east to the Urals. And even when they were rebuilt, the priority was tanks. Tanks won battles. Trucks were an afterthought. The Soviet leadership faced a terrifying reality. They had the men, they had the will, but they didn't have the wheels. They were fighting a 20th-century war with 19th-century logistics. And unless they solved this problem, the sheer size of Russia would not save them, it would swallow them. The Germans were winning the war of movement because they were the only ones who could move. By 1942, the situation was desperate. The Soviet industry had performed the miracle of evacuation, moving thousands of factories east. Tankograd was churning out T-34s. But the logistical crisis was getting worse. The Soviet army was growing. Millions of men were being conscripted. But the number of trucks in the Red Army was actually decreasing. The pre-war fleet of GAZ and ZIS trucks had been decimated. Tens of thousands had been captured or destroyed in the catastrophic retreats of 1941. The remaining trucks were falling apart. There were no spare parts. Rubber was in short supply. Soviet drivers were resorting to stuffing tires with straw or rags because they had no inner tubes. They were diluting fuel with kerosene, ruining the engines. The horse population was also plummeting. Horses were being killed by shelling, dying of starvation, or being eaten by hungry soldiers. The starving front was a literal reality. Frontline units were often subsisting on meager rations because the food simply couldn't get to them. Artillery batteries had to hoard shells for weeks to fire a single barrage because the supply wagons were stuck in the mud. German generals, like Manstein and Guderian, noted that Soviet offensives had a short breath. They would hit hard for 2 days and then stop. The Germans knew why. The Soviets ran out of supplies. This allowed the Germans to regroup and counterattack. It became a predictable cycle. The Soviet giant would lunge, run out of steam, and get pushed back. Stalin knew he couldn't win like this. He needed a way to bridge the gap between his factories and his front lines. He needed hundreds of thousands of vehicles. And he needed them to be better than the fragile, two-wheel drive trucks his own factories used to build. He needed a truck that could handle the Russian mud. A truck that didn't care about snow. He turned to his allies. The United States had passed the Lend-Lease Act. The arsenal of democracy was opening its doors. but getting the supplies to Russia was a nightmare in itself. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk were dangerous, plagued by U-boats and the Luftwaffe. So, the Allies opened a back door. A door that would change history. The Persian Corridor. To save the Soviet Union, the Allies had to pull off one of the greatest engineering feats of the war. They had to build a supply line through Iran. The Persian Corridor was a route that connected the Persian Gulf to the Soviet border in Azerbaijan. But in 1941, it was barely a trail. It wound through scorching deserts and over treacherous mountain ranges. The infrastructure was non-existent. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and British forces went to work. They expanded ports. They built roads where there were only goat tracks. They upgraded the Trans-Iranian Railway. It was a massive, dusty, chaotic undertaking. And then, the cargo started to arrive. Ships from America docked in the Persian Gulf, their holds filled with crates. Inside those crates were the CKD kits, completely knocked-down trucks. To save space on ships, the trucks were shipped in pieces. Huge assembly plants were built in the desert. Local Iranian workers, supervised by American GIs, assembled the trucks on the spot. Engines were dropped in. Axles were bolted on. Tires were inflated. And then, the convoys began. Thousands of trucks, driven by Soviet and Allied drivers, crawling north through the mountains. It was a grueling journey. The heat was intense. The dust clogged the filters. The mountain passes were icy and dangerous. But the river of steel flowed. And the star of this river was a specific vehicle. The U.S. Army had standardized on the GMC CCKW deuce and a half. But Studebaker, a smaller car company, had also produced a truck design, the US-6. The U.S. Army didn't really want the Studebaker. They wanted to keep their fleet standardized with GM. So, almost the entire production run of the Studebaker US-6 was earmarked for Lend-Lease. It was unwanted by the Americans. But for the Russians, it was the Holy Grail. The Studebaker US-6 was a 2.5-ton, 6x6 truck. That 6x6 part was the key. All-wheel drive. It had a powerful Hercules engine. It had high ground clearance. It was built like a tank. When the first Studebakers arrived at the Soviet handover points, the Red Army drivers were skeptical. They were used to their feeble GAZ trucks. They climbed into the high cab of the Studebaker. They felt the power of the engine. They drove it into the mud. And instead of getting stuck, the Studebaker roared, all six wheels churning, and powered through. The Soviet drivers looked at each other in amazement. This wasn't just a truck. It was freedom. It was the end of the tyranny of the railhead. The Germans, watching their own supply lines crumble in the Russian winter, had no idea what was coming up the road from Iran. They thought they were starving the beast. But the beast was being fed. And it was getting a new set of legs. By 1943, the Studebaker US-6 had become more than just a machine in the Red Army, it was becoming a legend. The Soviet soldiers, who were known for giving affectionate nicknames to their equipment, christened it the Studder. At first, the Soviet hierarchy treated these foreign trucks with suspicion. The manuals were in English. The tolerances were tighter than Soviet equipment. They required high-grade oil and fuel, which were scarce in Russia. But the Soviet drivers quickly realized that the Studer was a forgiving beast. They discovered that the Hercules JXD engine was robust enough to run on low-octane Soviet gasoline, provided you didn't push it too hard. They learned that the truck was officially rated for 2.5 tons off-road, but in the desperate reality of the Eastern Front, it could carry 4 or 5 tons without complaining. The 6x6 drive system was a revelation. Most Soviet and German trucks were 4x2, meaning only the rear wheels were powered. In the Russian mud, a 4x2 truck is a stationary object. The Studebaker drove all 6 wheels. It clawed its way through the Rasputitsa mud that swallowed German panzers whole. A cult of that Studer began to form. To be assigned as a driver for a Studebaker was a badge of honor. It meant you were elite. Drivers guarded their trucks jealously. They slept in the cabs. They scrounged for the best oil. They wrote letters home praising the heater in the cab, a luxury unheard of in Soviet vehicles, where drivers often suffered frostbite. The truck's durability became legendary. There are stories of Studebakers hitting mines, having a wheel blown off, and limping back to base on 5 wheels. There are stories of them being submerged in river crossings, dried out, and starting up again. The sheer volume of deliveries changed the look of the Red Army. Over 400,000 American trucks were sent to the Soviet Union. The vast majority were Studebakers. By 1944, if you saw a Soviet convoy, it wasn't made of Soviet trucks. It was a sea of olive-drab American steel. The German soldiers were baffled. They would capture a position and find empty crates marked Studebaker Corp., South Bend, Indiana. They couldn't understand how the primitive Russians were suddenly more motorized than the Wehrmacht. The German officers had mocked the Soviet reliance on horses. Now, they watched through their binoculars as Soviet infantry dismounted from high-sided American trucks, fresh and ready to fight, while their own men marched on foot. The Studer gave the Red Army the most precious commodity in war, mobility. It allowed them to shift reserves faster than the Germans could react. It turned a static, defensive army into a fluid, offensive juggernaut. The Soviet soldier knew that he wasn't alone. He knew that somewhere in America, workers were building these machines to help him kill fascists. And for the driver sitting high up in the cab, gripping the large steering wheel, that Studer was the best friend he had in the world. The Studebaker US-6 did more than just carry beans and bullets. It became the platform for one of the most terrifying weapons of World War II. The BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher. The Germans called it Stalin's organ because of the howling sound the rockets made, resembling a demonic church organ. The Soviets had developed the rocket launcher early in the war, but they had a major problem. They didn't have a truck good enough to carry it. The early Katyushas were mounted on the Soviet ZIS-6 truck. The ZIS-6 was weak. When the rockets fired, the massive recoil rocked the truck violently. The chassis would crack. The suspension would collapse. Worse, the ZIS-6 was slow and had poor off-road performance. A rocket launcher is a high-priority target. Once it fires, the smoke trail points a giant arrow at its position. Shoot and scoot is the only way to survive. The ZIS-6 couldn't scoot. It would get stuck in the mud trying to escape, and German artillery would wipe it out. Then came the Studebaker. Soviet engineers realized the American truck was the perfect mount. It had a heavy-duty steel frame that could absorb the violent recoil of 16 rockets launching in seconds. It had the power to carry the heavy launch rails and the crew. And most importantly, it had the speed to get away. They bolted the launch rails onto the bed of the Studebaker. They put blast shields over the windows to protect the glass from the rocket exhaust. The result was the Guards mortar. Batteries of these Studebaker-mounted cartouches became the fire brigade of the Red Army. They would race to a sector, set up in minutes, unleash a devastating salvo that turned a square kilometer into an inferno, and be gone before the first German counter-battery shell landed. The mobility of the Studebaker made the Katyusha deadly. It allowed the Soviets to mass artillery in a way the Germans couldn't predict. A German commander might think he was facing light resistance, only to have 50 Studebakers roar out of the forest, unleash 800 rockets, and vanish. The psychological impact was devastating. The sound of a Katyusha barrage is unlike anything else. It is a terrifying, shrieking wail. And knowing that these launchers were now mounted on highly mobile, American-built chassis meant there was no safe place on the front. The Studebaker transformed the Katyusha from a defensive novelty into an offensive sledgehammer. It was the perfect marriage of Soviet firepower and American automotive engineering. The Germans began to fear the silhouette of the Studebaker truck not just because it brought supplies, but because it brought fire. They learned that when they saw those trucks line up on a ridge, the sky was about to fall. While the Red Army was enjoying the benefits of Detroit's assembly lines, the Wehrmacht was descending into a logistical hell. The German arrogance of 1941 had come back to haunt them. They had invaded Russia with a hodgepodge of vehicles. As they conquered Europe, they had seized trucks from France, Britain, Czechoslovakia, and Holland. It seemed like a smart move at the time, free equipment. But by 1943, it was a nightmare. A German panzer division might have 2,000 vehicles. But those vehicles might be made up of 50 different models from 20 different manufacturers. Imagine the mechanic's despair. He needs a carburetor for a Peugeot truck. He has a box of parts for a British Bedford. The truck next to him is a Czech Tatra. None of the parts fit. This lack of standardization crippled the German army. As the trucks broke down, they couldn't be fixed. They were abandoned by the side of the road. The Germans were forced to rely more and more on horses. The image of the high-tech blitzkrieg was a lie. By 1943, the German supply lines looked like something from the Napoleonic Wars. Thousands of Panj wagons, peasant carts stolen from Russian farmers, struggled through the mud. Horses died by the millions. They froze in the winter. They starved in the summer because the Germans couldn't bring up fodder. And then there was the Opel Blitz. The Opel Blitz was a good truck. But it was 4x2, two-wheel drive. In the Russian mud, it was helpless. German soldiers spent half their time pushing their own supply trucks. They watched with envy as the captured Studebakers, which the Germans prized highly, drove circles around them. The German rail network was also failing. The rail gauge, the width of the tracks, in Russia was wider than in Europe. The Germans had to laboriously convert the tracks or offload supplies onto Russian trains. Partisans blew up the tracks constantly. The German soldier at the front was starving. He was low on ammo. His tank had no fuel. He received letters from home telling him about the Allied bombing of German factories. He realized that his army, which prided itself on organization, was completely disorganized. The contrast was stark. On one side of the line, the Soviets were streamlining. They used one main tank, T-34, and one main truck, Studebaker. On the other side, the Germans were complicating. They had 5 different types of tanks and 50 types of trucks. The German logistical spine snapped under the weight of its own complexity. They had laughed at the primitive Russians. But the Russians had learned the most important lesson of industrial warfare: keep it simple, and make a lot of it. The Germans were defeated not just by the T-34, but by the spare parts catalog they couldn't manage. A truck is only as useful as what it carries. And the Studebakers were carrying the fuel that powered the Red Army, not just gasoline, but food. By 1943, the Soviet agricultural heartland, Ukraine, was occupied or destroyed by the Germans. The Soviet Union was facing famine. The Red Army soldier was tough, but he couldn't fight on empty. Enter the American canning industry. The United States sent 4.5 million tons of food to the Soviet Union. The most famous item was tushonka. This was stewed pork. But it wasn't the standard Soviet variety. It was made in America, specifically for the Russian palate, based on recipes provided by Soviet officials. Millions of cans of Spam and tushonka flooded the front lines. The Soviet soldiers joked about it. They called it the Second Front. As in, where is the Second Front? It's here in this tin can. They joked, but they ate it. And it kept them alive. It gave them the protein and calories to march 20 miles a day and dig trenches all night. The Studebakers also carried the raw materials of war. High-grade aluminum. The Soviet T-34 engines were made of aluminum. Without American aluminum deliveries, T-34 production would have been cut in half. Aviation fuel. The Soviet Air Force relied on high-octane American gas to fly their fighters. Explosives. A huge percentage of the chemicals used in Soviet artillery shells came from U.S. chemical plants. Boots. Millions of pairs of army boots were shipped over. The Red Army marched into Berlin wearing American leather. Communication. The Germans had mocked the lack of radios in Soviet tanks in 1941. The Studebakers brought thousands of modern radios. Suddenly, Soviet tank commanders could talk to each other. They could coordinate. That Studer was the delivery system for a modern army. It brought the food that fed the soldier, the boots he walked in, the ammo he shot, and the radio he used to call for victory. Nikita Khrushchev later admitted in his memoirs, "Without Spam, we wouldn't have been able to feed our army. We had lost our most fertile lands." Marshal Zhukov said, "Now they say that the Allies never helped us. But one cannot deny that the Americans shipped over to us material without which we could not have equipped our armies." The German officers laughed at Soviet logistics because they only looked at the start of the war. They didn't see the millions of tons of supplies crossing the oceans. They didn't see the aluminum, the steel, and the meat that were feeding the bear. They were beaten by a global supply chain that stretched from the cornfields of Iowa to the steppes of Kursk. And the vehicle that tied it all together was the truck from South Bend, Indiana. By 1944, the Red Army had perfected a military doctrine that terrified the Germans. It was called deep battle. The concept was simple in theory but incredibly difficult in practice. First, you smash a hole in the enemy line with massive artillery and shock troops. Then, you send the mobile groups, tank armies, rushing through that hole. Their job wasn't to fight the enemy on the front line. Their job was to drive deep into the rear, 100 or 200 miles behind the enemy, destroying command centers, supply depots, and cutting off retreat. But deep battle had a fatal flaw in the early war years. A tank army is a hungry beast. It consumes thousands of gallons of fuel every hour. It shoots tons of ammunition. If the supply trucks can't keep up with the tanks stop. When the tanks stop, the enemy regroups, surrounds them, and destroys them. This is what happened to the Soviets in 1942 at Kharkov. They broke through, ran out of gas, and were annihilated. But by 1944, the equation had changed. The T-34 tanks broke through. And right on their bumpers were the Studebakers. Because the Studebaker US-6 was a 6x6 off-road truck, it didn't have to stick to the roads. When the roads were clogged or destroyed, the Studebakers simply drove across the open fields, keeping pace with the tracks. This meant that the Soviet tank commanders never had to look over their shoulders. They knew the fuel was there. They knew the ammo was there. They could push their tanks to the absolute limit of endurance. The German generals were baffled. Their experience told them that an armored spearhead had to pause every few days to resupply. They would plan their counterattacks based on this pause. The Russians will stop at the river, they would say. We will counterattack then. But the Russians didn't stop. They crossed the river. They kept driving. The Studebakers were carrying floating bridges, engineers, and fuel barrels right in the combat zone. The German decision cycle was shattered. By the time the German High Command issued orders to defend the town, the Soviet tanks and their American supplied trucks were already 50 miles past it. General Guderian, the master of the Blitzkrieg, watched in horror as his own tactics were used against him with superior mobility. He realized that the Wehrmacht was fighting a war of movement against an enemy that moved faster than they did. The Red Army had become a motorized juggernaut. Infantry didn't march anymore, they rode in the back of Studebakers. This meant they arrived at the battle fresh, rested, and carrying heavy weapons, while the retreating Germans were exhausted from walking. The steep battle was no longer a theory. It was a reality made of steel and rubber. And the engine of that reality was the Hercules JXD motor humming under the hood of an American truck. June 1944. Operation Bag Ration. This was the offensive that destroyed Army Group Center and effectively decided the war in the East. The terrain in Belorussia was a nightmare of swamps, marshes, and thick forests. The Germans believed it was impossible to move heavy mechanized forces through it quickly. They had fortified the main roads, assuming the Soviets would have to use them. But the Soviets had the Studebaker. They built corduroy roads, laying down millions of logs across the marshes. The six-wheel drive of the Studebakers allowed them to grip these slippery, uneven wooden roads and carry heavy loads where German trucks would have slid off and drowned. The scale of the logistics was staggering. To support the offensive, the Soviets moved 400,000 tons of ammunition and 300,000 tons of fuel before the first shot was fired. Almost all of it was moved by American Lend-Lease trucks. When the attack began, it was a tidal wave. The German front collapsed. As the German units tried to retreat, they found themselves in a footrace with the Red Army. It was a race between German horses and American trucks. The outcome was inevitable. Soviet mechanized infantry, riding in Studebakers, outflanked the retreating German columns. They would race ahead, set up roadblocks, and wait. The exhausted German soldiers, marching on foot, pulling their carts, would walk right into the trap. It was a slaughter. The roads of Belarusia became graveyards for the Wehrmacht. Thousands of German vehicles, out of fuel and broken down, were bulldozed off the roads to make way for the endless columns of Studebakers pushing west. The speed of the advance was unprecedented. The Red Army advanced 400 miles in just a few weeks. They liberated Minsk. They crossed into Poland. German logisticians estimated that such an advance was mathematically impossible. No army could sustain a supply line that long, that fast. They were judging the Soviets by German standards. They didn't realize that the Red Army had completely motorized its logistics battalions. They had mobile repair shops mounted on Studebaker chassis. They had fuel tankers that refueled the tanks on the move. Operation Bag Ration was the ultimate triumph of logistics. It proved that the most dangerous weapon in the Soviet arsenal wasn't the tank or the gun, it was the ability to put those weapons exactly where the enemy didn't want them, faster than the enemy could react. The green flood of Russian uniforms was carried on a tide of olive-drab steel. In the early years of the war, Soviet artillery was fearsome but static. Big guns are heavy. Moving a 152 mm howitzer required a team of heavy tractors or slow horses. If the enemy moved, the artillery was left behind. By 1944, the Studebaker had solved this problem too. The US-6 was powerful enough to tow the heaviest Soviet field guns. This created the concept of motorized artillery on a massive scale. Artillery batteries could now keep up with the tank spearheads. Imagine the German defenders. They see a wave of T-34s approaching. They prepare to engage. Usually, they would have a window of time before the heavy Soviet artillery could be brought up to pound their positions. But now, right behind the tanks, came the Studebakers. They would slew the big guns around, unhook them, and begin firing within minutes. The Germans were hit by heavy shellfire almost instantly. And just as quickly, the batteries could pack up and move to avoid counterfire. Shoot and scoot became the standard operating procedure. This saved countless Soviet lives. The Studebaker was also used to tow anti-tank guns. The Soviets formed anti-tank brigades, highly mobile units equipped with 57 mm or 76 mm guns towed by American trucks. These brigades acted as firefighters. If the Germans launched a panzer counterattack, these brigades would race to the sector, deploy their guns in an ambush, and shatter the German armor. They could redeploy 3 or 4 times in a single day. The German tankers, used to fighting static anti-tank lines, found themselves constantly running into walls of fire that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The Studebaker also carried the crew and the ammunition in the bed of the truck. It was a self-contained fighting unit. This mobility allowed the Soviets to achieve overwhelming local superiority. They could mass 200 guns per kilometer of front because they could pull guns from quiet sectors and rush them to the breakthrough point overnight. The German officers, whose own artillery was increasingly immobile due to lack of fuel and horses, watched with envy. They saw the primitive Russians executing complex artillery maneuvers that the Wehrmacht could no longer perform. The truck had transformed the gun from a defensive anchor into an offensive sword. May 1945. The end of the Third Reich. Berlin was a smoking ruin. The Red Army had fought its way from the Volga to the Spree. And when the victory parades were held, the Tiva-34 tanks took pride of place. But rolling right beside them were the Studebakers. By the end of the war, the United States had supplied over 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union. There were more American trucks in the Red Army than there were in the Wehrmacht at its peak. They were everywhere. They were towing the artillery that shelled the Reichstag. They were carrying the bread that fed the starving citizens of Berlin. They were carrying the Soviet soldiers who wrote their names on the walls of the Chancellery. It was a strange sight. Soviet soldiers, waving red flags, riding in trucks built in South Bend, Indiana, rolling through the capital of Germany. It was the ultimate proof of the failure of Nazi ideology. They had laughed at the Soviet Union's primitive industry. They had laughed at the American to materialism. But the combination of Soviet manpower and American industry had crushed them. After the war, the politics of the Cold War tried to erase this history. The Soviet Union downplayed the role of Lend-Lease, wanting to claim the victory entirely for themselves. The Studebakers were quietly retired or sent to work in the collective farms, where they ran for another 20 years, beloved by their drivers. But the soldiers who fought knew the truth. In private letters and memoirs, the Soviet veterans were clear. "Without the Studebaker, we would have been stuck in the mud," one artillery officer wrote. The tank won the battle, but the truck won the war. The story of the Studebaker US-6 is the story of the unsung hero. It didn't have a big gun. It didn't have thick armor. It wasn't glamorous. But it was the glue that held the Red Army together. It was the bridge that spanned the vast distances of Russia. The German officers laughed at the beginning of the war because they saw an army of peasants walking. They stopped laughing when they saw an army of professionals driving. And the sound of their defeat wasn't just the boom of the cannon, it was the steady, reliable hum of an American engine, driving relentlessly toward Berlin.